There is a chapter in one of the greatest novels ever written that has been quietly unsettling readers for over a century. Not because it's violent, not because it's scandalous, but because the argument it makes is so ruthlessly logical, so coldly accurate about human nature, that most people who encounter it don't know how to argue back. Dostoevsky wrote it. It sits inside the brothers Karamazov. And what it proposes is this: the institution built in Jesus' name was never actually following Jesus. It was following something else entirely, something older, something that understood human beings far better than any message of liberation ever could. Let's sit with that for a moment before we go further. The story Dostoevsky constructs is called The Grand Inquisitor. The setup is medieval Spain. Jesus has returned to earth quietly, without announcement, and people recognize him immediately. They gather around him. He heals the sick. He raises the dead. He is unmistakably the figure the church has built its entire civilization around worshiping. And then the cardinal, the Grand Inquisitor, the most powerful man in the church, has him arrested. That night, in the prison cell, the Inquisitor visits Jesus alone. And he talks. For a long time he talks. He explains everything. Why Jesus had to be arrested. Why Jesus' return is in fact a catastrophic problem. Why the thing Jesus originally taught, the message of radical freedom, of individual moral responsibility, of each person carrying their own divine spark, was the most destructive gift ever given to the human race. And Jesus, throughout this entire monologue, says nothing. He just listens. We'll come back to what he does instead of speaking, because that moment is the entire point. So what is the Inquisitor's argument? Because it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. When Jesus walked through ancient Judea, telling people they were free, genuinely, spiritually, fundamentally free, to choose their own path toward the divine, what he was actually doing, the Inquisitor argues, was placing an unbearable weight on people who never asked to carry it. Freedom sounds like a gift. In practice, for most human beings, it functions more like a sentence. Think about what genuine freedom actually demands. It demands that you think for yourself, that you sit with uncertainty, that you make moral decisions without anyone handing you a rule book and saying, follow this and you'll be fine. It demands that you tolerate not knowing, that you live with the anxiety of having chosen one path while being aware that you could have chosen differently. Authentic freedom is psychologically exhausting in a way that obedience simply isn't. And here's the Inquisitor's sharpest point. Most people don't want it. Not because they're weak or broken or spiritually inferior, just because the architecture of ordinary human life isn't built for that kind of weight. Most people want dinner on the table at a predictable hour. They want to know the rules. They want someone trustworthy to tell them what's good and what's evil, so they don't have to agonize over it every single day. That's not a flaw. That's a description of being human. Jesus, in offering radical freedom to everyone equally, made a beautiful gesture toward the few who could actually receive it. The philosophers, the mystics, the rare individuals whose inner life was strong enough to bear the full weight of self-determination. But what about everyone else? What about the vast majority who genuinely cannot carry that burden without collapsing under the anxiety it creates? This is where the Inquisitor explains what the church actually did and why, in his framing, it was an act of profound, if darkly twisted, compassion. The church, he says, looked at the chaos that pure freedom produces and made a decision. It decided to take the burden back, to organize, to create structure, hierarchy, doctrine, ritual, the entire architecture of institutional religion, specifically so that ordinary people wouldn't have to think for themselves. It replaced the terrifying open horizon of genuine spiritual freedom with a clear map. Do this, avoid that, confess here, follow these commandments, trust us to interpret the mysteries on your behalf. And to do this, the church had to become something Jesus never intended. It had to become an empire. It had to use authority, spectacle, and the threat of punishment. It had to operate through what the Inquisitor calls miracle, mystery, and authority, the three tools that reliably capture human imagination and obedience without requiring anyone to think too hard. In this telling, the church wasn't corrupted accidentally over time. It made a deliberate, eyes-open choice to prioritize the happiness of the majority over the truth that Jesus carried. The Inquisitor is completely transparent about this in Dostoevsky's text. He tells Jesus directly, "We are not with you, we are with the other one. We chose order over truth. We chose the shepherd over the flock's freedom. And we did it because the flock asked us to, even if they never said the words out loud." The brilliant and disturbing element here is that the Inquisitor doesn't claim this was easy or pleasant. He frames it as a sacrifice. The inner circle, he says, took on the burden of knowing the truth, that Jesus' original vision was too demanding for most people, and then carried the additional burden of hiding that truth and managing everything behind a curtain so ordinary believers could live in structured, comfortable, meaning saturated lives without ever having to confront the raw, terrifying freedom that the actual gospel offered. This is the tension at the heart of the story, and arguably at the heart of every institution ever built around a liberating idea. The moment a revolutionary truth gets organized into an institution, the institution faces a structural problem. The truth that founded it was disruptive, challenging, difficult to domesticate. But institutions require stability, predictability, hierarchy, and the ongoing compliance of large numbers of people who have neither the time nor the inclination to wrestle daily with foundational questions. So the institution gradually replaces the live question with a managed answer. It replaces the open road with a paved one. It replaces the fire with a very well-designed, controlled flame inside a very secure box. This isn't unique to Christianity. You see exactly the same dynamic in political revolutions that become authoritarian states, in grassroots social movements that become bureaucratic nonprofits, in artistic movements that become commercial genres. The original energy was real. The original insight was genuine. And somewhere in the translation from spark to institution, something essential got administered out of existence. Now here's where Dostoevsky does something philosophically brilliant that goes beyond just making the church look bad. He makes the Inquisitor's argument genuinely difficult to refute on its own terms. If you accept the premise that most people cannot bear the weight of radical freedom, and if you accept the premise that suffering is worse than comfortable illusion, then the Inquisitor's position is internally consistent. He is doing what he claims, reducing suffering for the greatest number of people by removing their freedom and replacing it with structured meaning. His argument isn't that freedom is bad in the abstract. It's that freedom distributed equally to people with unequal capacity to bear it produces more suffering than carefully managed unfreedom. And he's not entirely wrong about human psychology. We know from everything we understand about anxiety, about decision fatigue, about the way people respond to uncertainty, that too much freedom of choice can genuinely be paralyzing. There's real research on this. The Inquisitor was doing 19th century literature, and he was ahead of what we'd eventually call the paradox of choice. Give people too many options, and they freeze, regret, and feel less satisfied than people given fewer options. Structure genuinely does help people function. So what's the counter argument? Where does the Inquisitor go wrong? Jesus doesn't answer with logic. That's the thing. He hears the entire argument. He listens to every word. and then he walks over to the old man and kisses him, gently, on the lips. That's it. That's his whole response. And the inquisitor, who had an answer for everything, who had constructed an airtight philosophical fortress around his position, is completely undone by this. He can't process it. His lips tremble. He opens the cell door and tells Jesus to leave and never come back. What just happened in that moment? Why does a single act of wordless forgiveness collapse a logically coherent argument? Because the inquisitor built his entire case on a specific assumption about human nature, that people are fundamentally incapable of growth, that the gap between who most people are and who they would need to be to bear genuine freedom is permanent, fixed, unbridgeable, that the sheep will always be sheep and therefore need a shepherd forever. His compassion, if you can call it that, was premised on giving up on people, on managing them kindly rather than believing in them genuinely. And Jesus' kiss says, without words, that this is wrong. Not because it's illogical, but because it doesn't account for love as a force that operates on a different timeline than reason. It doesn't account for patience. It doesn't account for the possibility that the person in front of you, however lost, however comfortable in their chains, however apparently incapable of bearing freedom, that person has something inside them that is not finished yet, that hasn't reached its final form, that is still on some level on its way somewhere. The spark is the image that matters here. Even in the inquisitor himself, the most convincing argument against human potential that Dostoevsky could construct, the kiss lands and something stirs. The cold fire he thought he'd extinguished long ago is still there, faintly glowing. He doesn't change. He doesn't recant. He sends Jesus away and presumably goes back to running his operation. But something was touched. Something was reached. And Dostoevsky is making a claim with that image. No one is so armored by function and reason and cynicism that the possibility of genuine love cannot find a crack. The inquisitor's error wasn't cruelty. It was impatience. He looked at humanity at a particular moment in its development, correctly diagnosed its limitations, and concluded those limitations were the final word. He forgot or refused to believe that development is a process that doesn't end when we want it to, on the timeline we prefer, with the people we've decided deserve to grow. There's a version of this argument that says the soul is not a snapshot. It's a story still being written, and you don't get to read someone else's last chapter while they're still on the first few pages. What does all of this actually mean practically today? It means that every time an institution tells you it's making things easier for you by thinking on your behalf, it's worth asking what that convenience is costing. Not because structure is always corrupt or because all authority is illegitimate, but because the inquisitor's bargain, comfort in exchange for self-determination, is always on the table. It's always being offered. And it's always described in language that makes it sound like generosity. The real Jesus, the one Dostoevsky is trying to recover from underneath centuries of institutional management, is not a figure of easy reassurance. He's genuinely demanding. He's asking you to be responsible for your own moral life, to develop your own conscience, to sit in the uncomfortable space between not knowing and figuring it out. He's offering you the anxiety of freedom alongside whatever that freedom might eventually become. The church, as Dostoevsky renders it, made a different bet. It decided that most people would trade that future for peace today. And historically, it wasn't entirely wrong about the terms people were willing to accept, but the kiss remains. The spark remains. And perhaps, given enough time, people figure out for themselves that the comfortable cage, however beautifully decorated, is still a cage. That's the gamble built into a vision of genuine human dignity. It requires extraordinary patience. It requires refusing to give up on anyone, including the people who've given up on themselves, including apparently even a Grand Inquisitor.